everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. Today on the podcast, we're following up on the discussion that began at last week's GNSI Tampa Summit 6 at the University of South Florida. That topic is the Golden Dome and its role not just in nuclear defense, but in nuclear deterrence. Our guest today led much of that discussion on this much talked about space-based missile defense. Manolis Priniotakis, CEO of Intelligence and National Security Directions, will be here in just a moment. First, though, a final recap on Tampa Summit 6. Themed Cracks in the Lamp, Freeing the Nuclear Genie. It featured one of the best speaker and panel lineups we've ever put together. Our keynote speakers included retired Air Force General John Hyten, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Commander of U.S. Strategic Command, the Honorable Frank Miller, former Special Assistant to the President, who was also a former Assistant Secretary of State, the Honorable Christopher Hill, a 5-time U.S. Ambassador, appointed by 4 different presidents and former Assistant Secretary of State, as well as GNSI Executive Director and former Commander of U.S. Central Command, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. In addition to these veteran leaders and experts, we had the opportunity to see the next generation of national security, as 4 students from the Future Strategist program presented nuclear-related research to the audience. Here's a big shout out to Santiago Zambrano, Malia Otero, Michael Di Leonardo, and Joshua Felix. Great job standing up there and presenting to some of the most knowledgeable experts in the world on this topic. We'd like to thank our partners who helped make the summit such an outstanding success. That includes the USF College of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Institute for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies, and the Project on Nuclear Issues team at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Without their support and partnership, the summit would not have been as successful and compelling as it was. All videos from Tampa Summit 6 will be available on our YouTube channel in the near future. If you want to know right away when they drop, be sure to subscribe and sign up for alerts. One final note, our latest decision brief also focuses on discussion featured at the summit last week. The 3-body trap, the new geometry of nuclear deterrence, is authored by Dr. Song-Hyun Lee, who is also the moderator for the panel discussion on the same. It's a compelling article that you can find on our website. Okay, time for our guest this week. Manolis Priniotakis is the CEO of Intelligence and National Security Directions, an advisory firm delivering consulting, publishing, events, and education in the intelligence and national security domains. He's also a retired member of the Senior National Intelligence Service. He moderated a panel discussion last week focused on nuclear deterrence and the Golden Dome. Will they keep the peace? And he sat down with GNSI Strategy and Research Manager Dr. Tad Schnaufer for a deeper dive on that topic.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ted. I appreciate being a part of it.
Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation as we wrapped up our conference on nuclear deterrence last week or in the past preceding weeks. One of the topics that wasn't covered too heavily during that conference was the issues of non-state actors getting their hands on nuclear material. Could we talk about that a little bit?
Thank you for having me be part of this conversation, but also a part of the event on nuclear deterrence that you hosted. It was a great couple days and covered a lot of territory. In one of the issues that didn't get a lot of treatment, because most of it was really about state issues, which was not surprising given the environment we're in right now with a couple active conflicts involving nuclear powers, but also effective end of arms control and expansion of of the Chinese arsenal, for instance. There wasn't a lot of discussion about nuclear security, the threat of terrorist organizations. There was a little bit, you had a student who did a great job discussing nuclear smuggling issues. Again, maybe it's a testament of the times that we don't think it's not as much of a front and center issue as it would have been, say, 10 years ago. Sure. If we'd had this discussion maybe not 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if we'd had this discussion 15 years ago, it probably would have been one of the primary things we would be talking about: security of facilities, the risk of terrorists getting their hands on nuclear weapons or nuclear materials. And partly that's probably, the success, broadly speaking, of the terrorism fight and more broadly against some of the players that were pursuing those technologies. But also, enhanced security measures. This has been a primary focus of the Department of Energy and NSA and other parts of the government for years. And I guess to some extent, there's maybe an outcropping of that is that you are not seeing as much attention paid. At the same time, we had the great honor and great pleasure of listening to Frank Miller, literally legendary Frank Miller, John Hyten, who is the commander of STRATCOM. They really, for the most of their careers, were dealing with nation state actors. So that may have also been a contributing factor, but it's still a risk. I know a lot of the cases of nuclear smuggling do tend to be, people, scam artists and so forth. As I remember somebody I used to work with saying, there's a lot of red mercury out on the market, but how much of it is actually real nuclear material is a question mark. But it is something that's still worthy of consideration, and there's still people in the government who are focused on it, as they should be. But I did think it was striking that most of the conversation, almost 98% of the conversation was really focused on the state threat.
Well, and kind of bridging that gap, I remember when the war in Ukraine began with Russia's invasion February 22, there was concerns of if, and obviously this did not come to fruition, but if the Russians lost too hard, they started having an internal collapse. Now, again, you have the Russian nuclear arsenal, just like with the collapse of the Soviet Union, kind of falling out of command. So what do you do with all these different materials and facilities when the government is literally collapsing and you're having independent states proclaimed?
Yeah, in part of the discussion during the event that I thought was really interesting was, I think the title was Military Applications of Nuclear Energy.
Yeah.
And there was a discussion about, deployment of SMRs, like 1 megawatt, 5 megawatt container-sized SMRs being used in, forward operating locations. But then what happens if you have to abandon them? Do they become a target on the battlefield? That with the kinds of things that we're seeing today in really energy intensive systems, whether it's, AI at the edge and all the kinds of systems, even directed energy weapons down the line, things that are really energy intensive. How do you provide that energy supply in a way that doesn't, that maybe alleviates some of your concerns about your diesel supply line and so forth, but also then makes them a target? And you had one expert talk about how, say you have an SMR on site to support some sort of forward deployed asset, and then it becomes targeted. Not only have you lost your power source, you got a problem on the battlefield as well. But that it makes sense in other, whether it's islanding bases to be able to continue to operate. I know the one that was raised was Guam. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe Alaska a little bit less so. But it's an interesting aspect that how do you actually bring some of this technology to bear in ways that potentially creates vulnerabilities as well.
Right, because it's not just the weapon piece. It's also the energy piece that comes out of the discussion on nuclear topics, and that's expanding rapidly. But those small modular nuclear reactors aren't necessarily something new. The Army had one in Antarctica for a number of years at its research station, seeing how that worked in a remote environment, and possibly having on the battlefield. Even though we don't have them deployed now, the Russians have some floating barges up in the Arctic, and obviously we're seeing ground. What if you have a ground facility like the Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine, or obviously Chernobyl? Yeah,
and on top of that, I guess we don't want to call it proliferation, but, the like AUKUS agreement that will expand the nuclear submarine capabilities of the Australians. It brings smaller reactors to a broader set of users. Obviously, the Australians are great allies of the United States, and there's not a concern there. But even some of the panels that we heard, you had representatives from Korea, for instance, talking about an AUKUS for East Asia and more sharing, and that, and then brings in additional allies, but it does broaden the exposure of miniaturized reactors to a new set of potential users.
Right, because it brings that expertise in that you're able to maintain that within your country. You build that institutional knowledge, and then that could be turned into a weapon over time if necessary, or not if necessary, if the state decides to do that.
Yeah, and this is where some of the discussions about the latent capabilities of threshold states, in the absence now of any sort of arms control measures really being in place. Obviously New START is gone. There's no treaty arrangement with the Chinese, other than, as somebody pointed out during the course of the day, it might have been, actually, I was going to say it was Frank Miller. I don't think it was Frank Miller. There is actually one treaty obligation that the Chinese have on nuclear weapons. It's the Outer Space Treaty, not to deploy nuclear weapons in China. I thought that was actually a very good point, that there actually is a multilateral arms control agreement that the Chinese are party to. But how we think about allies potentially considering their own weapons programs, or at least creating some sort of threshold capability in the absence, or not in the absence maybe, but the question of the U.S. extended deterrence. That was the panel you had of Korean scholars explicitly raised that as an issue. Yeah. That there is doubt, at least as far as they were arguing that there is doubt in Korea over the extended deterrent. I've been able to spend some time in Japan recently, and the Japanese scholars, not talking to government officials, but Japanese academics, they use language like explicitly that in the Cold War, and this is different than Korea, but in the Cold War, Japan was effectively a peripheral state. In the U.S.-China competition, it's a frontline state. Okay, Korea was a frontline state during the Cold War, so it's maybe not completely comparable, but they're highly concerned about a conflict over Taiwan, and almost see as inevitable that there would be strikes on U.S. assets in Japan if the United States were to intervene in that situation. And what I've heard from them that is borne out has been they've seen that now with the U.S. conflict with Iran, that Iran did strike at region, and we saw it last year in the 12-day war, and we've now seen it this time as well, that there is now implicit, or there is now empirical evidence that an adversary can strike out at U.S. assets in the region. And the Japanese, and what I heard from your scholars from Korea, they feel the same way, similar concern.
And you hear that conversation among U.S. allies too about should they get their own nuclear weapons, because it seems like that's the only true deterrent that's left that really brings home the fact that a major power is not going to mess with you if you have that capability. You have a delivery system and you have a nuclear weapon. So the Poles have talked about it, the Scandinavians, a few other panels have discussed it. The South Koreans and Japanese are looking at re-looking at how they see that weapon. So how does that affect, obviously we mentioned the treaties that are gone. We still have the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons regime within the UN. How's that holding up as we look at this possible proliferation, or at least proliferation of nuclear institutional knowledge?
Well, I mean, it's been some time since I looked specifically at the NPT and the IEA. The IEA has said things. They've intimated that they, know where the they potentially know where the enriched uranium in Iran is. Still functional, still does its job. I don't think its role really changes in the absence of the bilateral arms control agreements. This is a big issue when the U.S.-Iran negotiations were taking place, that there were, verification measures that were being created, but then part of that was still reliant on the IAEA inspection regimes to be able to do, look at things that are in the light. It's the question of what happens outside of the light. It's the old metaphor of the guy looking for his keys in the parking lot under the street light. The light is best there, but it's, who knows where the keys actually are.
Right, because those are super supranational organizations, trying to provide monitoring. So you have the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, doing some of that. You have also some UN, monitors doing it as well, as we saw maybe in Iraq in 2003 or before the invasion of 2003. So what are we looking at today? What's the climate look like or the geopolitical, nuclear regime look like as China's increasing its arsenal and capabilities? The North Koreans are likely doing the same. We also are seeing Pakistan's now, in a conflict with Afghanistan. We're seeing nuclear-powered states are in conflict around the world. Obviously, Russia, Ukraine.
Yeah, and it's not getting getting better. Right. I guess is the short answer. That at the same time, we have still seen these regional conflicts that have where nuclear dynamics are below the surface or underpinning them, but have not yet. Thankfully, escalated into something greater. It was interesting during the event, the discussion about sort of traditional Herman Kahn escalation ladder came up multiple times, to include General Hyten holding the book up and asking students if they'd read it, and then proceeding to say he wasn't a huge fan of it. But I think multiple people made references to it, how there is still the risk that that a regional conflagration or regional conflict could expand into a larger exchange. And I think the line, the classic line, is that a nuclear war is not going to start over the poles; that it will start at a regional level. But we had India and China have a border, renewed border skirmishes. There's the regular threats from in South Asia. It's holding, but it's fragile. And, they talk about the doomsday clock, moving even closer. And if I'm not mistaken, the last time it really moved was round about the time of the executive order on Golden Dome. I think that was one of the, I have to look to see if there's actually a correlation, if it was that indeed date. But, a renewed look at strategic defenses, has always been a question about, or anytime there's a discussion of strategic defenses, it's a question of whether or not that, supports strategic deterrence or if it makes it more fragile.
Well, then why don't we touch base on the Golden Dome while it's in the conversation here, and we're talking about the regime and how do we deter this? As we're noting that the number of states with nuclear capabilities, roughly 9 now. What's the Golden Dome do for deterrence against them and also supporting some sort of stability within the system?
Well, it was interesting. I was very pleased to moderate the panel where we had a discussion of Golden Dome, and then later oversaw a breakout session on Golden Dome as well, where I was really looking to get students and practitioners engaged with each other to come up with some ideas about, frankly, it was like a research, developing a research plan to understand things a bit better. Because, one of the things you do here, and I don't think it's as fair as people are sometimes saying, a lot of times here, well, we don't know anything about it. We don't know what it is. They don't know what it is. And that's not entirely fair. Some of it's extracting or extrapolating from the contracts that have been put forward so far. But there have been some statements. The general who's in charge of it now has been a bit more explicit about what it is. But there's still, I think, questions about what it means for deterrence, what it means for technology development, what it means for ally perceptions, what it means for adversary perceptions. All of these things can be theorized, and some of it can be drawn from historical, anti-ballistic missile work or missile defense, or even the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative from the Reagan administration. But there still are a lot of questions about what it is and what it aspires to be. As I had somebody say to me today, a system that envisions the possibility of a very large constellation of space-based interceptors armed with directed energy weapons able to strike hypersonic glide vehicles in the boost phase. I don't know if we're going to be able to do it, but it would be pretty sick if we could.
I'm about to say, that sounds intense.
So, this is where there are a lot of questions. The technology, the pathways that need to occur, that need to be followed. In the U.S. government context, obviously, with the Department of War, Department of Defense leading it, it's a massive acquisition issue on the backdrop of real changes they're trying to put in place on how the government does acquisitions of defense systems. So, it is starting to become a little bit clearer that you're going to have this. It's a multi-layered system, so you have multi-layered contracting approach. Inevitably, there's a handful of primes that are going to be the key players on the major reference architecture. But this administration and sort of the way defense tech has been going, there's much more room for newer entrants to try to make have some impact, including university researchers. So right now, there's a $185 billion 10-year IDIQ contract. And, IDIQ contracts, there's an overarching amount, and then the companies that are qualified to be part of it have to compete for the work within that contract. So there's 2,400 companies roughly that have been qualified to bid on work under the contract. So you're going to have a handful of primes, a number of the space specialists. So there was a contract in November of last year to do prototypes of the space-based interceptors, and I think there were 6 or 7 of them, but it was like $120,000 contract. So it's very small. It's not a lot. You're gonna, you and I could probably spend $120,000 in an afternoon if we really put our minds to it. It's not a tremendous amount of money to build a space-based interceptor, but this is fine. This is a prototype. But these players were like Saronic, I believe Anduril is one of them. Lee Palantir was, there's a handful of SpaceX, a handful of companies that are space. And then there's this group at the bottom. I shouldn't say at the bottom. There's this additional group that are really focused on the battle management, sensor development, there's a number of ancillary technologies that are going to come out of it. So, and I'm going on about this, but it's all part of the broader, capability development. How this plays out in a strategic sense, some of it, this is a conversation we had with the students in the afternoon, was, if it's really looking like it's going to be successful, say we're several years down the line. But a quick aside, there is a question about the timeline of this, right?
Of course, yeah. There's
an electoral timeline. There's a congressional electoral timeline. Will this have it sustained support across time? But, you literally have the same sort of questions that came up with SDI and other anti-ballistic missile systems, anti-missile defense. Does it become destabilizing, right? Is it a environment where if encourages adversaries to pursue novel systems that, there's some evidence that Chinese were pursuing a fractional orbital bombardment system, which you basically bring a weapon into orbit and then deorbit it to strike. So it's technically not on orbit. That's a fractional orbit. The Soviets pursued this technology in the 70s because of concerns about early detection. So all of these things play in. It literally gets into like classic strategic security dilemma stuff.
Right.
It's Thucydides, right? The Thucydides trap. If it looks like it's going to be successful, do the adversaries, decide to take either some sort of action to, pursue their own capabilities, or do they take some sort of preemptive action to deal with it?
Well, we saw some discussion on that we have evolving technologies as well. So even though this might be a 10-year process, how do you keep up with the evolutions that have happened? Because with AI and hypersonic missiles, all these different technologies are coming online and are evolving rapidly. If we've seen anything in the war in Ukraine, the evolution of drones have not only evolved, but then been adapted to counter drone technology. And then new drones come in, going back to your point, it kind of creates a security dilemma. But in this case, it's a technological dilemma that's moving very quickly. So how do you evolve in time and government contracting, as you know, is typically kind of slow. So how do you keep pace with the technology, keep the development moving forward, and then also outpace our adversaries?
Yeah, and that's where, I think you were putting it, this is not happening in a vacuum. The adversaries have a vote here as well, right? They're constantly evolving, and we're talking on a Wednesday at 4:00. I almost guarantee somewhere in DC there's a conversation going on right now about lessons learned from Ukraine.
Sure.
And obviously now there's other lessons to be learned by others by the war in Iran. But there's a lot of discussion about implications for surveillance, counter surveillance. If I remember hearing somebody early on say one of the big lessons from Ukraine was if it moves, it can be killed. Maybe that's not strictly true, and then there's some areas where it maybe doesn't apply. Given the terrain in Ukraine, doesn't apply to all the conflicts that are likely to be pursued. But what it really has done is, you change the thinking on, what is an appropriate innovation timeline for new systems. Like with the drone technology, it's matters of weeks for the Ukrainians to innovate. From, I guess in our context, from TRL 0 to deployment in like a matter of weeks, and it's pretty difficult for that to happen in the U.S. context, except in some very, very narrow places where they do have more flexibility. But even then, a matter of weeks is pretty hard.
Right. Well, and what we're talking about here, obviously, with nuclear technology, you're talking about very exquisite, I think, would say, delivery systems, and then obviously warheads capable of megaton explosions. So these are not simple, in a sense, simple drones. So
Yeah, and that's a big issue that sometimes, I having spent a lot of time in the Department of Energy, it's an issue that sometimes is not front and center, but kind of think it should be, is the modernization of our own capabilities, whether it's the modernization of the actual warheads, the nuclear systems, but also a lot of discussion at your event over the modernization and the timelines and capabilities of the ground-based strategic deterrence. So the Sentinel is a replacement for Minuteman III, but also the Columbia class sub, which I like to point out as a resident of the District of Columbia. It is the Columbia class is named for the District of Columbia.
It's not Ohio?
It's not Ohio.
Okay.
It's not Columbus. It's not Columbia, Maryland. It's the District of Columbia, which I guess was our turn in the sequence. And then also, when the next generation of bombers are going to come also. But there's a massive modernization of facilities across the DOE complex. And it's fundamentally important to the security of the country. Places like Kansas City and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Amarillo, Texas. There's parts of the nuclear weapons complex that I think most people don't think that much about or even know that much about. Which, in all fairness, a lot of these facilities, when they were established in the 40s, were secret cities, so nobody knew about them. As I once had a conversation with a very senior DOE person who was complaining about how hard it is to get to facilities across the complex. I was like, well, for what it's worth, it may be hard to fly to Richland, Washington, or to Pasco, Tri-Cities, Washington, to go to Hanford. But 70, 80 years ago, you had to have a security clearance to know it even existed. So it's all relative. But there's, a lot of work that's going on to upgrade the facilities and build new facilities. And there's a tremendous amount of work that's needed to be done to modernize them and, actually get some people out of Manhattan Project era facilities. I mean, it's vitally important, and it's unfortunately quite expensive because it's not cheap to build nuclear facilities safely and appropriately. But as I think it was Frank Miller quoted General Mattis, that the amount of money is not too much to spend on survival.
Right.
And and that was the point that was made repeatedly through the event, was just how fundamentally important nuclear weapons still are underpinning our security posture.
Yeah, I think there's two big points that came out of a lot of the discussions, and what we're talking about here is, many people forget that, the Cold War ended, but nuclear weapons remain. So that deterrence theory still remains. You still have major powers that could, eliminate the human race with a nuclear exchange. So that the Cold War ended, but the threat remains.
And has gotten more complicated with the entrance of the Chinese. Obviously, this much smaller nuclear powers, but the other piece is not just the multipolar, but also multi-domain. You have real concerns about hypersonic glide vehicles and other hypersonics. You have drones. There's cyber and concerns about left of launch threats. And on top of that, something that didn't come up, now that I think about it, during the event, not explicitly at least, is concerns about quantum computing and the future of cryptography and information security to be able to ensure the stability of the national command and control systems as well. So that's all of a piece, so that yes, the Cold War ended, nuclear weapons continued, but have actually gotten more complicated than they were at that time.
But in many ways, we're paying them less attention. I think one thing was brought up was you had this workforce development idea. You don't have students really hearing about it. You don't have kids hiding under desks, where they have that kind of exposure. Like, oh, this is actually something we need to worry about from even, an early age, and need to grow up at least and have a generation of people ready to take the helm and speak about it, from an educated standpoint.
Which is why I think it was great that you partnered with the CSIS Pony program. And us also exposing your students to it, to the issues through the event, to raise that profile. Again, to cite Frank Miller excessively, but he talked about how there were decisions that were made, and a couple decisions specifically he pointed to literally pay less attention and less funding to. Provide less funding to the weapons program, but also as a result, effectively a loss of generation of nuclear technicians, nuclear scholars. It just became, much less of a in-demand field.
Right. Well, just like, Sovietologists or Russian scholars in 1991 were probably like, dang, I'm no longer at the forefront. But now they're right back at it, with the current issue with the war. Yeah.
And I've talked to some people even about like attitudes towards Golden Dome. Nope. I get the sense that most people in the public not paying attention. Whereas the SDI system was a national debate. And, you think about why that was. Okay.
Because
it had this, people tagged it with Star Wars, right? It had this evocative name. Star Wars was popular. Also, on top of that, you did have generations of people who had grown up, or a couple generations who had grown up hiding under their desks in drills, hyper aware of the nuclear weapons threat. I remember when I started at the Department of Energy, not long after I started in the policy office, before I moved into the intelligence office, I went to a retirement party, and this guy who had been there for a long time told this story that when he joined the Department of Energy like a couple days after Reagan was elected in 1980, and Reagan was elected on platform of cutting taxes, confronting the Soviet Union, and to his mind, eliminating the Department of Energy. And his first thought was that maybe this wasn't the best move to like leave the IEA in Paris to go work for a department. But, here we are 46 years later, and the department's still around and has a vitally important role in dealing with the modernization of the stockpile.
Well, and speaking of modernization, one thing that came up multiple times at the conference is just how old some of this equipment is when it's launched. Some of our submarines and things, and our stuff is relatively new. When you think of even some of the Russian equipment that, submarines launched in the 50s, that they're still using some of these devices. Because you think, I guess the perception might be that this stuff's relatively modern, but some stuff was pushed out in the 70s and 80s and is still operational today.
Yeah, and that's where there's been the big effort on modernizing not just the weapons and the complex, but also the delivery systems. And it was interesting. I heard somebody say, actually, in a sidebar conversation, that there's been some concern about how the speed in which some of the systems have moved, in part because of concerns about some specialized parts, and also just there's a from a construction perspective. I know this is something the DOE complex is facing, is the availability of craft labor in some of the trades.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I said this from the stage, and I was at a deterrence event in Washington a few months ago, and it was pretty surprising to hear the modernization of one of the facilities on the DOE complex in Kansas City. They expressed concern from the stage about potential for increased costs and maybe even program delays due to the Kansas City Chiefs building a new stadium. Mm-hmm. That they're competing with the Chiefs now for welders and HVAC technicians and electricians and plumbers. And now with the nationwide push on increased shipbuilding as well, there's high demand there. Mm-hmm. Just general construction demands elsewhere, and maybe not always a mobile workforce. These are issues that come through and have an impact in unexpected ways on national security.
Yeah, because when you're in a national security discussion, I think a lot of people, particularly our students, they think tanks and airplanes and soldiers and that. But actually, a lot of the issues are here on the home front, if you will. And we had a major port conference last year, and one of the major threats that they faced was a lack of a workforce with the institutional knowledge, whether you're talking about shipbuilding or other maritime issues. And we've heard a lot of that same reverberate today throughout the conference.
Well, and there was an echo of one of the discussions in your port security event that came up today, or came up during the event. I wasn't able to attend the event, your port security event in person, but I listened into most of it online. And
thank you.
The discussion at the end with the port CEOs was fascinating. In particular, the one, I remember which port it was, Port Canaveral, talking about concerns about security of loading the big new, like Icon of the Seas, the new big cruise ships, while also loading LNG at the same time, and started talking about I almost feel hesitant to raise this myself now. I couldn't believe, I was surprised he was raising it at the time, but they said, like, what keeps you up? And he started talking about Operation Spiderweb. Yeah. The Ukrainian drone attack
deep into
Russia, bringing through containerized systems. And, his concern about a lack of any sort of counter UAV system there. It was just fascinating. That kind of came up obliquely during the deterrence event, just because, in part, with in theory, from what we understand about Golden Dome, is that it's everything from ICBMs. It is layered. High CBMs, hypersonic glide vehicles, cruise missiles, and then down to drones coming from wherever they'd be coming from, offshore or whatever.
And it'd obviously be difficult to guard every port in the state and every critical infrastructure around the country. So it's going to be a momentous task, and obviously there's much work to be done there.
And one thing I would add on that is I sometimes talk to students about, why are strategic weapons called strategic, right? And it literally gets down to, like, Clausewitz, that it's bypassing the tactical and going straight to the strategic objective, and whether or not, there are other capabilities, whether it be, any cyber strategic capabilities that adversaries may have that could have similar effects. And now we have these other systems that we have to be concerned about. It's all of a piece on how we protect the homeland, whether it's in a more active way, more so than maybe the more traditional passive way.
Well, and coincidentally, I was just reading recently that I think it's the Belgian port of Antwerp is actually putting in Norwegian American surface-to-air missile systems to protect against drones, because they've had so many drone issues around. So they're kind of putting these military-type devices around ports in Europe. And again, we're seeing that an amplification of national security issues coming, I guess, more local. Instead of, because you kind of think national security is just an army somewhere or an air force, somewhere. But what about that local defense piece? The Golden Dome will probably have to take a layer of that.
And those actually, I hadn't heard about that. That's interesting. I used to live in Belgium and was bringing. It was long ago in the internet industry. I was working in the internet industry and working in Belgium, and we were bringing things in from the UK. And I actually spent a lot of time looking at the Port of Antwerp, Port of Rotterdam.
Yeah.
And
Rotterdam's a major.
And just how fundamentally they are important they are to the economic security of the countries.
Yeah,
the whole continent.
I'm gonna say pretty much the whole continent. I mean, Rotterdam and Antwerp are massive. So, as we've touched on quite a bit during the podcast. So let's kind of zoom it back in. Let's pretend you're an advisor to the president today. What are the major issues when we look at the nuclear environment? Would you want to discuss with him and give him some advice on how would you approach that?
It's an interesting question. I, having just recently retired from the federal government, there are a few things that would be on my mind. But in this context, the thing that I think is so important is that we really do focus on the health and progress of the modernization of the DOE complex. It's so easy to get lost in the shuffle. It's in some ways it's just another line in another budget in the broader federal government. But it is also fundamentally important to the underpinning of our national security. And I'm a huge fan of the DOE facilities, of the labs. I used to take members of Congress and congressional staff to visit them and to just sort of revel in the expertise. But there are facilities where they're in really rough shape. There are like 40s and 50s era facilities. Yeah. And to really, focus on them. Actually, you know what? Somebody told me this the other day that, if you wanted to get President Trump in particular to understand these, having, a background in real estate, you should go and look at them. And I don't know if he's been to, I actually don't know if he's been to any of the production sites. I imagine not. But to go down to the Savannah River site and see some of the state of some of the facilities, people do remarkably good work in things that are in really rough shape. Same at Y12, and it's acknowledged and they're working on it, but really I think needs to be doubled down. And the other piece is really focusing on the workforce to support it as well. One of the things that's really challenged that nuclear workforce is the reduction in the civil nuclear industry. Yeah. Now we've seen a rejuvenation. Maybe we'll see a return of that workforce. But really, whether it's the people who can manage the construction, who can actually do the welding, this costs money. It takes time, but it's so vitally important.
Yeah, and I think that's the piece about the workforce development is it takes time, and it's not something you can just turn on tomorrow. So you have to build that in over years. So thank you so much for your support of the conference in general, obviously, and staying with us today and having this conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to have this affiliation with USF and GNSI and really did enjoy the event and enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks again.
Special thanks to our guest today, Manolis Priniotakis, for his insight into the Golden Dome and its role in nuclear deterrence. Thanks also to Dr. Tad Schnaufer for conducting the interview. Next week on the podcast, we're going to visit with a group of students from our Future Strategist program. GNSI helped create and mentors this student organization for USF students interested in careers in national security. We provide a wide variety of out-of-the-classroom educational opportunities for FSP, and one of those is an academic conference they'll be hosting in a couple of weeks at the GNSI International Security Experience. We're looking forward to having these USF students on the podcast again. If you don't want to miss that episode or any other episode, be sure to like and subscribe to Out the Boundary on your favorite podcast platform. And we really appreciate you sharing some time with us today. You can find GNSI on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Tell your friends and colleagues as well. And you should definitely check out our monthly newsletter. All this on our website at usf.edu/GNSI. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the boundary.